Now, I'm not saying this will solve everything and this will make this movement will be running the country. In a way, I'm just trying to explain why I think it failed to get the traction it could and point to some things, some, if you like, strategic and tactical errors. And this applies to all political movements. I think this is what the climate change movement has had to learn. You have to sell this to the average person who's not interested in the science, who doesn't know about the coal industry and this and that. It's all just a bunch of words and language. And telling them they're going to die in the next 5 minutes is not the way to do it. You need a sane sort of common denominator. I think this is how all politics is won and lost, actually.
May all that you stand for and that we stand for be preserved under the providence of God for the happiness of mankind.
The trouble is caused by unthinking people who carelessly throw away ageless ideals as if they were old and outworn machinery.
But it is the values of individual liberty, equality before the law and the supremacy of people over the state to which we can always with confidence return as a powerful and uniting force.
Australia is not a secular country. It is a free country.
G'day and welcome to Pellowe Talk. I'm Dave Pellowe, and one of the things I love doing is learning. I like my ideas being challenged. I'm very strong in my ideas and the things that I believe. I'm very convinced and sure about, and will argue passionately for them. But I want to argue to understand, as well as to share truth whenever that's possible. And so one of the things I like doing is hearing from people who disagree with me, especially if they can be civil and sincere, bring good faith arguments to it. I'm engaging with heaps of lefties at the moment from America who are just passionate about taking people's guns off them. And most of them are bringing really insulting, demeaning, really low quality arguments to the debate. And it really doesn't do anything to engender a conversation or dialogue. The people I want to talk to aren't people necessarily who agree with me, but people who are going to engage in good faith and really say things that can enlighten me. At the end of the day, this is something I want to endorse to you as well, because if you don't understand your opponent's ideology, if you don't understand their arguments at least as good as them, if not better than them, then you actually don't understand the strength of your own position, and you might be wrong. And if your position hasn't been tested, hasn't been critiqued really, really well, then you really have no right to be confident in your position. And you should feel comfortable to be confident if you're constantly comfortable to be challenged. And one of the people who I trust a lot to challenge me and argue with me, because I find him not riding a partisan or ideological horse into any kind of contest, just genuinely trying to think about things as objectively as possible, is Dr. Jonathan Cole. Now, let me see if I can tell you a little bit about him. He was one of the speakers at this year's Church and State Summit. And listen to this. Dr. Jonathan Cole is a scholar, writer, translator, commentator, lecturer, and speaker, specialising in political theology. That's the intersection between religion and politics. He's the host of the Political Animals podcast, honest conversations about the political, theological, and cultural ideas that shape who we are in the 21st century. Jonathan has a PhD in political theology and MA in Islamic theology and Middle Eastern politics, and a Bachelor of Arts with honours in modern Greek language and history. He spent 13 years working in a number of Australian federal government departments and agencies in Canberra, including 7 years in intelligence, most recently as a Senior Terrorism Analyst. Jonathan, always great to have you on Pellowe Talk, and welcome back.
Thank you. It's great to be with you, Dave.
Now, one of the things I like doing, you've just heard my intro, I like reading your Facebook posts, which are sometimes duplicated, if short, on Twitter. So wherever I catch you, it's great. And I wish I could listen to more episodes of the Political Animals podcast. I'm actually keen to go back and listen to the one about women in ministry, which I'm sure you will handle as even-handedly as possible. But let's have a chat about some of the things which have piqued my interest recently on your Facebook page. We're going to move through 2 or 3 topics. And for those people watching on YouTube or on Facebook, we're going to keep this video on this platform nice and short. But if you want to see the full conversation, which will probably go for about an hour, head over to the website goodsource.news, and we'll be having the full discussion there. So some of the topics I wanted to chat to Jonathan about are these. And the first one is the plausibility of Australia's freedom movement. Did it affect some change, and was it successful overall? Also, the topic of the concept of anti-elitism. We in the right wing often talk about elites, and we're talking about the World Economic Forum and the United Nations, and those people who think they're so much better than us that they should be telling us how to live and what to do, throwing away tradition and everything else like that. We're going to have a chat to Jonathan about whether that attitude is always as useful as we think it is. Also, we're going to chat about this post from a week ago saying that the Liberal Party failed because it underestimated the Conservative base. But are freedom voters and Conservatives overestimating the Conservative base in Australia? I'll have a chat with Jonathan about that. And we're also possibly, if we have any time left in an hour, going to talk about radical secularists' rabid hatred for Christians and religions in the political sphere. Sound good, Jonathan?
Sounds good. Sounds good. I was waiting when your famed rhetoric was going to make its first appearance, so I'm glad to hear it early. I'm just waiting for the lying harlot press to make an appearance, but there you go.
The lying harlot media, Jonathan.
Oh, sorry,
lying
harlot media.
That's it. Is my rhetoric famed? Is it?
Wow. I think you're partly known for your flamboyant, shall we say?
Bit of a brand.
Yeah.
There we go. You're making me blush, laughing at myself. Well, let's have a look at this first one from you. And in it, you say, while I think it's plausible that Australia's freedom movement affected some policy change in New South Wales and Victoria over the last 12 months, I think it's fair to declare it a political failure on the basis of the recent election. Here's why I think it failed. One, it didn't have big numbers to begin with. Participants in the movement, out of a mixture of exuberance and wishful thinking, grossly overestimated its numbers. And for every active participant, there were several lukewarm supporters. And for every lukewarm supporter, there were many quiet critics and opponents, as well as many indifferent. I don't want to read the whole post. Let's actually go through this. If we need to take more than 15, 20 minutes on this, then I'm okay with that, because this is really, I think, something to sink our teeth into, although we won't get bogged down. I would like to get to the other ones. So the freedom movement, Jonathan, you've been a freedom observer. You've basically, I guess, sympathetic with some of the... and why don't I let you describe your position rather than putting words in your mouth, possibly? Yeah,
sure. Look, I'm a philosophical conservative, but not a partisan conservative. That's I know, a painful distinction, and we can go into that if there are two of your listeners or viewers who have the interest. So just to sort of transparently say where I'm coming at this from, I'm deeply sympathetic with some, to the extent that I can understand what the the message or desires of the movement were, particularly on mandates, which I think on the whole were both unjust and unnecessary, and still are where they are in force. I think there's much to criticise in Australia's COVID response. We could get into the nitty-gritty of lockdowns. A lot of the key signature policies, at the very least, are contentious and debatable, and it's questionable how effective they were on one point or the other. But right. I wasn't a participant in the movement, for an active participant, for reasons we can get into as well, if that's of interest to anyone. But
if brief, touch on them.
Well,
maybe briefly, why not? If freedom was important and you thought it was being transgressed a little?
Well, partly there's a very sort of boring practical reason, which is just I'm way too busy to get involved. Doing the podcast, working as an academic, family life, and the rest of it. So that's the sort of boring reason, which I know for the true believers is not only boring, it's a pathetic reason not to get involved, which leads me to the other reason. And this is a personal thing, and this goes to one of the reasons I think it it failed ultimately, and that is that too many what I would call cranks got involved and became too prominent too early on. And this always happens in every nascent political movement, in my view, because a lot of the most politically engaged, active, and motivated are prone to conspiratorial thinking, obsessions on specific issues that most people are not interested in, and just with all kinds of weird agendas. And this is a risk for all nascent political movements because these people are early adopters. And this is not a left-right point. You get them in every sort of political movement and ideology. And there's a choice then very early on in the movement, which is a very difficult choice. And that is, do you suppress, marginalize, and try and evict these voices in view of trying to make the movement have the widest appeal possible in order to get out of the margins into something big? Or do you embrace these people, but do so in the knowledge that that's going to limit you to a relatively small constituency? Now, this is just a personal thing, and it's a matter of conscience. And I think conscience is an important dictator of your politics. And if it's not,
and that's exactly what everybody in the freedom movement is fighting for, is
Well,
that
yeah.
liberty of conscience, so that you can act according to your will. So for somebody to condemn you for following your conscience now it would be hypocritical. And I can
not only that,
agree
but
with your
if you
point.
don't understand how powerful conscience is, and the fact that it does do a kind of trauma to go against your conscience. And this doesn't just apply to vaccines and mandates. This goes for right across the political spectrum.
It's a really good point, Jonathan.
And I certainly I respect most those who are led by conscience in their politics, even if it leads them to a polar opposite position from me.
Yeah.
And I say that because there are a lot of people involved in politics who have no conscience on both sides. These are your kind of exploiters and your hucksters, your shysters, whatever. Now, just this is my personal conscience. I'm not a fan of what I call conspiracism, which is a bit of an academic term. And for me, I can't get involved in the movement that has lots of voices that, in my heart of hearts, I know to be not only wrong, but to have what I would call dangerous ideas, were they to be accepted widely. And so my conscience doesn't actually allow me to stand shoulder to shoulder with those people. Now, I can respect people whose conscience allows them to do that, because there's a fork in the road here. This is all about to get metaphysical on conscience. But that my opposition, if you like, to what I consider just bad thinking, which I think has social consequences, is a game stopper for me. But for other people, they can overlook that, again, out of conscience, because their conscience is so strong on whatever it is that's motivating them. So, for example, they might be on mandates, and so they're willing to listen to a whole bunch of stuff about the World Health Organization and secret changes to the Constitution and stuff to do with corporations and the definition of persons and the pandemic and this on the vaccine and that and the other. You end up with a whole cacophony. But the point is, we all have to make these conscience choices. But just to finish off that earlier thought, not earlier thought, but just that preamble about my interest in the movement. My day job really is a political analyst. And let me be the first to say that I actually think this was a very significant political movement in the history of Australia, because how often do we see, I know it wasn't exclusively right-wing, but let's say predominantly, how often do we see predominantly right-wing, grassroots-led, citizen-led protest organizations that are national? This is quite a significant phenomenon that deserves to be studied, understood, because it tells us something interesting about Australian society and the political moment that we're in, or at least it should be for anyone who is interested in understanding our political experience.
Yep. Likewise, there was a lot of what I call low quality thinking that I witnessed in the freedom movement. And it's very hard as a champion of freedom and liberty and ideals which are frequently labeled conservative or libertarian. It was very hard to I guess, speak to those people and say, look, everything you're fighting for is right, but some of you are following leaders and regurgitating what they say without actually thinking about it carefully enough. There was a lot of people who sprung up and essentially offered dog whistles. They would just, it was red meat that they were throwing out. And yeah, look, I didn't distance myself from the movement at all. And like you, I was fully engaged in politics in a way that I have been for many years, and like you for many years as well. I did attend some protests, and there were definitely some people there that I'd be happy to break bread with, but wouldn't have much in common with. The smoking ceremonies and the syncretistic false religions that were going on were something I wasn't comfortable with. And at the same time, I thought, look, you know what? I think I just have to tolerate this for the sake of pursuing the bigger objective.
You know what, Dave?
Yeah.
You know what I'd say? At the end of the day, all politics involves compromise. People, and we all know that happens in the parliament, okay? There's compromise to get policies through, legislation, preference votes. We know all that. But even individual citizens in our own political philosophies, ideologies, policy preferences, approaches, relationships, you have to make some compromises just like you do in all life. I mean, a marriage only works if there's a bit of give and take, right?
Right.
I mean, you can't find someone that is your ideological mirror with whom to have a perfect marriage. And so I think there's a compromise choice here for those of us, let's say, who start sympathetic to the whole mandate issue. And that is, you either, such as in your case, and I personally think both of these are respectable. People might disagree, but that's just me. So you can make one compromise, which is, okay, I'm going to overlook paganistic, heretical stuff for me as a Christian, if that's your thing, or some tactics that I completely disagree, or some rhetoric I'm uncomfortable with, or some agendas I don't like. That's fine. Or you make the other compromise, which is the one I made. And I did do some stuff on mandates in terms of speaking out and in my own place of employment. I'm not saying they were great things, but I did try to speak up and do some things in my own context. But the compromise I made was to do less because quite frankly, I couldn't live with myself making that other compromise, because these aren't sort of objective philosophical points. These are very personal, subjective compromises that we all have to make, and we're all judged by.
And you know what? One of the compromises I made, and to a large extent still do, is to not tackle some of the quite low quality strategies and theories that are present in the collective freedom movement. There's some really low quality ideas in there that are just not worth fighting for. They're just a complete waste of time, won't ever achieve anything, and have very little merit in their first instance. But it's just not a hill worth dying on, because so many people will tune out and stop listening altogether for that very reason that I actually want to continue talking about your Facebook post, those thoughts that you had there in the first place. And that is that they're not very good at hearing criticism. They're not very good at, essentially right-wing people can be just as prone to build and insulate an echo chamber as the people on the left wing. Let's get back to your post and just talk about your first point. One of the things, I guess we'll use a collective term loosely, freedom people. One of the things freedom people frequently got wrong was grossly overestimating how many people were there in the movement. That essentially it wasn't as big as we thought. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I'll go further, Dave, and say not just in the movement, however we define that. Perhaps we could take some easy standards of definition here. Someone who has turned up to a protest or done something active to support it, or perhaps spoken out publicly in support of it, or helped bankroll, to some extent, the activities. Not only that, I think there was an overestimation of the quiet supporters who either were unable or unwilling to get fully on board, but who might be sympathetic to the message and thus there to be won as supporters in some context. I think this had consequences because it then feeds into the political calculations. And this is my impression from the outside, so I could be wrong, but it looked like there was this excitement about a kind of wave of disaffected coalition voters that were going to park their votes very strongly with minor parties championing the freedom issue, which would have some kind of appreciable electoral impact in the federal election, which I think we can say with some confidence is not what actually translated in the end.
I hope you're enjoying this conversation. You know what? We have to fight back against the censorship of big tech. Would you like to help? You can do that now by heading over to the website, goodsource.news. We're going to end the conversation here on this channel because we need to make sure that we're independent and not reliant on big tech. Head over to the website, goodsource.news right now for the rest of this great video.